and welcome to episode 123 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
I'm John Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, this is kind of a special episode because it's being driven by the news cycle of the last week, which has been all about law schools and the LSAT and very big abstract questions. So this is going to be a truncated episode.
Yeah, a surprise to us with some of these announcements, but I'm glad we've got a chance to get on top of this stuff. It's always nice when we can kind of stay at the crest of the breaking news wave.
Yeah, and we didn't pick a song because I don't know if there's a good song about rankings, but obviously we had to choose drinks. So tell me what you're drinking.
Oh, I was drinking regardless of a podcast. So this just happened to fall on top of my drinking. I opened a bottle of wine last night. It's just some old bottle of Cab. So I poured a very big glass of that, and that's what I've got in front of me.
Very nice.
What about you?
I had a huge Halloween party, not Christmas, Halloween party a couple weeks ago, and I had a ton of beer that we bought. People really went for the hard alcohol instead of the beer, so I'm having a Modelo left over from that.
Yeah, you ought to have booze until about 2026 at this rate. I saw the stash.
It was good. So given the special nature of this, we're not even going to fool around with like the usual discussion of test deadlines and things like that. We're going to get right to the discussion. And there are two things that we really want to talk about. First off is the U.S. News and World Report rankings and law schools from the top on down deciding that they're going to, quote unquote, pull out of this. And then secondly, we're going to talk about the LSAT-Optional decision by the ABA, which is part of a continuing series of steps that they are taking revolving around the use of the LSAT in law school. So let's get right to the rankings situation. And John, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
First off, U.S. News rankings are a big deal.
They are indeed. So much so that we've made it, I don't suppose it's a tradition yet because we've really only done it once, but we devoted an entire episode to the rankings when they came out for the 2023 law school rankings. That was episode 106. So this is something that we talk about a lot, something people pay a lot of attention to. And in many ways, they're kind of the de facto measure by which school, I hesitate to use this word, so this is in air quotes, worth, maybe prestige, is often measured by people.
Yeah, and we've been very critical of the rankings before because it's hard to take an entire school experience and turn it into a quantitative measure and say that, you know, this school is better than another school. Broadly, you could probably make those kind of claims, but it's really hard to say that this school is 20 and that one's 21st. But that's what they do, and they've been doing it for several decades now, and it's really become the tail that wags the dog because the rankings are so powerful that really the top schools never change, and you'll notice that the ranking of a school and the salaries that the typical first-year grad makes correlate really well. So I'm not saying it's causal, but I'm saying that it has grown into a synergistic relationship where the schools at the top tend to be the most competitive, have the highest scores, the highest GPAs, and their graduates tend to make the most.
Yeah, this is something we've talked a lot about over the years too, with this notion of how do you compare essentially like debt versus prestige. The cost of going to a higher school where you might not get the same kind of financial aid offers versus the prestige of going there, what it might mean for you in terms of reputation, in terms of opportunity, whether it's bragging rights or the job you might get. So yeah, this has obviously been a big idea in terms of how people make decisions about where to go and what to spend.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with how the rankings work, what they do is they actually use a number of different measures that they look at to kind of create these quantitative comparisons and, you know, internal scores. And it'll be things like the amount of debt that students have coming out, the expenditure per student, the GPA, the LSAT, and so forth. And there's another component, too, that deals with surveying, the legal profession about their perceptions of which schools are best. And then finally, the schools themselves participate in this process by actually filling out surveys. And one of the questions that is still not clear yet is how much the schools have participated this year, because the first survey pieces went out at least a month ago. And we can't tell whether or not these schools that are pulling out simply didn't respond to those or responded before and now are pulling out. But this is something where U.S. News has been taking public information, survey information, and then self-reported information from the schools and putting it all together and then creating these rankings.
Yeah, and they turn it into this giant algorithm, basically, this metric by which all these different factors are given various weights. So LSAT and GPA, for instance, is like 20% of the overall rank. And other things maybe factor in less, like student debt or employment rates and things like that. Bar passage, for instance.
Number of books in the library.
I remember that one. I remember us laughing about that with our heads in our hands.
Yeah, we've had an extensive conversation before about changes to the rankings because they make little changes, but they always end up having really very minimal effect, especially at the top. So then the question is that's what we have. We know they're important. We know that everybody's very aware of them. There's a claim actually that the law school rankings that U.S. News does are the most important of all the rankings that they do. Whether or not that's true, I'm not here to debate, but that claim has been tossed around.
You mean law versus U.S. News rankings, say like graduate schools or medical schools?
Business school, undergrad, that kind of thing. Exactly. That was something that actually came up in the ABA meeting that you and I both attended a few days ago.
It was on Friday.
So then what's the controversy here? We know this. People have criticized rankings for years. You can't turn this into a number, but they do.
Sure.
What happened that made everybody get excited last week?
Well, until now, all, as far as I know, ABA accredited schools have more or less actively participated, willingly volunteered this self-reported information, how much they spend on students, et cetera. Things that aren't public, but that the schools were willing to give to U.S. News as part of this. However, beginning, I think it was last Wednesday or so, on the 16th, what we started to see in a flurry of sorts was that several top law schools began to publicly announce that they would cease reporting their data to U.S. News and World Report for the rankings, as effectively opting themselves out of participating in this rankings process. And that may not seem like a big deal, but I mean, it breaks with huge tradition, and it really, in a way, is kind of a slap in the face for, as you said before, the tail that's wagged the dog. Something that has been more or less just the de facto way that things work. Schools are starting to actually rebel against it.
Yeah, and this has been largely misreported in the national media as to how this works. So in a few minutes, we'll get to the implications section, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But before we get there and we have that conversation, which I think is really the most important part of this, the better question here is why would schools do this? Why would a school like Yale, who was the leader on this, the very first one to announce, simply say, hey, we're out. We don't want to be a participant in this any longer?
Yeah, I think we should actually lean on Yale a little bit. Before we do, if you will indulge me, let me just run through the list of schools so far. So if people are curious as of at least this recording, here's what we've got. And I think in this chronological order, Yale was first, followed shortly by Harvard, and then Berkeley, Georgetown, Columbia, Stanford, Michigan, and I believe as of this morning now Northwestern. So that's 8 schools so far, 8 top law schools have all publicly announced that they were no longer going to submit information for this.
Yeah, that's 8 of the top 14. So these other schools like Chicago and NYU may pull out, but right now they're thinking to themselves, we're moving up in the rankings.
Maybe. It was something we'll actually talk about. I mean, we laugh, but it's worth a consideration. So first things first, if schools are starting to pull out of this, as clearly is the case, and more will follow. Which ones and how many, I don't know, but more are coming. Why would they do this? And one of the most useful things that I found was actually an announcement, a public letter, really, of explanation by Yale's dean, Heather K. Gerken, where she talks about exactly what motivated her and her team's decision to pull Yale out of this. And again, they were the pack leaders, in a sense. I'm going to quote from her from time to time as we go through this, but one of the things that she mentioned is, again, pretty bluntly, the rankings are profoundly flawed. As she says, they disincentivize programs that support public interest careers, that champion need-based aid, and that welcome working-class students into the profession. So some strong words of justification from Dean Gerken, to be sure.
Her letter was good.
Very good.
I liked Dean Chemerinsky's letter at Berkeley as well. He certainly, echoed some of the themes that she talked about. Why don't you run through some of those major objections that she cited as being problematic?
Yeah, that brief list I just rattled off, I think we should expand on each of those points, because each of them, in many ways, not only do they reflect the motivation for the schools, but I think they provide really informative insights into why it is that the rankings themselves are, as we described them, flawed in many ways.
Yeah, and the thing that I would add here is that, these deans are saying these are the problems we've had. What Dean Chemerinsky said was, look, we've told them this. We've actually made these objections, and this isn't new. We didn't just kind of announce this and be like, hey, we're going to take our ball and go home. We've been telling them this for a while. They don't listen. And so we're being restricted and we're going to take action on it. So I'll let you kind of run through some of those.
Yeah, that's a good point. The schools weren't just silently brooding in the corner about what they saw as injustice or unfairness. They've been trying to get these rankings to change, and this to me kind of felt like the nuclear option in some way. So, for instance, what are some of the things that motivated, at least per Dean Gerken, Yale's decision, and I'm sure the rest as well? One of the things that I thought was interesting is that the rankings effectively classify graduates who seek public service careers, or even those who receive, say, public interest fellowships. It treats them as though they're unemployed. The same is true for students who graduate law school and then pursue an advanced degree. So let's say they want to go get a PhD, for instance, as many do. It treats them as though they didn't get a job post-graduation as well. Employment percentages, employment statistics factor hugely into the rankings. And what it means is that it not just devalues those types of students, but it treats those kinds of students as like a black mark against the schools where these students are going. So that's one thing. They also, the rankings, as currently computed anyway, they exclude loan forgiveness programs when they calculate student debt loads. So again, per Yale, this discourages schools basically from supporting students who pursue that type of service career. Oftentimes, people pursuing public interest are going to get their student loans forgiven, but the rankings don't take that into account. So it treats those students as heavily indebted, which they aren't, as unemployed, which they aren't. And schools take a hit for this.
Yeah, the debt thing is they are in debt until the moment that it's all absolved by an LRAP program or what have you.
Yeah.
And so schools over the years, if they had a serious concern about this, they could move away from choosing somebody who professed an interest in public interest, knowing that that would actually hurt them slightly. What a lot of schools did, obviously, was say, look, we're going to still do this. And they almost, I'm not saying they made an agreement, but everybody knew they were going to take some. But if you wanted to tweak your ranking a little bit, you could maybe take fewer public interest seeking students.
Yeah.
They don't want that kind of incentivization. If you're a law school, it's like, that's a big part of your mission is to create public service.
Sure. I find it really interesting that this is coming from Yale as well, the school that since the very first time these rankings were ever published has been and remains number one. So the top ranked school forever, basically, is the one that got out in front of this first and said, we don't want to prioritize these rankings. We don't want to participate.
Yeah, a few of the uninformed commentators in the broader world were like, oh, these schools just want to be able to do what they want and they're, it's sour grapes. I'm like, yeah, it's Harvard, Yale, and Stanford.
Right.
They've been at the top. It's not sour grapes. It's the fact that this wasn't going to happen unless you had the top schools and do it. They had to be the ones.
So yeah, it's not just service careers either, though. There are other issues as well. For instance, Dean Gerken mentions the fact that the rankings basically discourage law schools from admitting and providing aid to students with, as she describes, enormous promise who may come from modest means. Basically, because LSAT and GPA are about 20% of a school's rank on the current metrics, money often goes towards recruiting students with the highest scores rather than those with the greatest need. It almost disincentivizes them from seeking out students with great potential, but for whom they might not get paid back or rewarded on the credentials of the student itself.
Yeah, what they're really saying is the money's getting diverted to other purposes, primarily buying better students. And what we've been saying for years is that one of the values of having a higher LSAT score and a higher GPA is that schools will give you more financial assistance for those. By the way, I wish I could say that that was suddenly going to change. It won't. We'll talk a little bit more about that. This isn't going to make the biggest difference, but certainly it was one of the things that they cited in this whole process.
Yeah. She mentioned, too, in her letter, I believe this is true, that Harvard and Yale are currently the only two schools in the country that still give aid to students based just entirely on financial need.
It's crazy.
It's baffling to me, but hopefully this could at least change some of that. And then, of course, debt is another problematic thing here, that schools are ranked on average graduate debt, percentage of students graduating with debt, rather than actually on how much financial aid that the schools provide to their students. What that means is schools, once again, are incentivized to accept students who can pay full tuition, or at least the majority of it, instead of those with substantial financial needs that they might otherwise have wanted to recruit or accept.
So what was her big summary then?
Well, I think I probably borrowed this quote from the first paragraph, but I thought it was such a great encapsulation that I saved it till now. What she basically says is that the U.S. News and World Report rankings approach, quote, not only fails to advance the legal profession, but stands squarely in the way of progress, which is a very eloquent criticism.
Yeah, she turned them into a whipping boy when it comes down to it here. She just really took them out. And that's what you need to do if you are going to be, make a statement like this and you expect other schools are going to follow. And, they got a lot of credit for having said this and for standing up. My comment would first off be, it took 30 years. All right. So let's not all of a sudden fall over ourselves in praise. And a lot of times when you look at the statements that were made by the various deans as to why they want to pull out, they really echo a lot of themes about over-reliance on certain metrics, problems with public service and debt. And I think those are all legitimate. I'm sure those are all complaints that are floating around out there. Other commentators have noticed that the Supreme Court of the United States is intending to render a decision on the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and ultimately UNC, which is an affirmative action case, which may lead to affirmative action being overturned in terms of the use of admissions. And this has been, debated repeatedly at the higher court level for really decades. But if that is the case, that will change the calculus of how students are admitted. And what schools could be doing here is saying all these things, but really kind of preparing for a post kind of SFFA Harvard world where it is a different process and they're giving themselves more latitude in order to be able to maintain diversity and to not be limited to just saying, hey, these LSAT scores have to match up, and all these other types of things. And we are kind of being held in place by the rankings and all the things that they do with public service and all that. So that is also a piece of background information that you're not seeing the schools talk about, but I'm seeing a lot of commentators, raise as an issue is like, boy, the timing of this seems real curious. We know this is coming out this summer, and here all of a sudden they're getting out of the rankings, which would probably be affected by that type of decision and what happens thereafter. So there's always a little bit of additional color as we look at this, a little bit more perspective. And I think that's one of the pieces that's out there. And if you want to learn more about that decision, there's a ton of analysis online from various sides talking about that. It's Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, but Caroline is also involved in that too. They're talking about overturning, I think was it Grutter versus Bollinger from years back. So a true legal deep dive, if you want to get into it. We're not going to get into it. I'm just going to point out that that is something that probably is playing a factor in causing this decision by these schools at this point. What I'm more interested in, John, is not why we are where we're at, because we are here. I'm more interested in the implications and the results of this. What's going to happen next?
Yeah. So when you think about this, it's kind of a balancing act from the school's perspective. They want the autonomy, they want the freedom to be able to make the choices when it comes to students' acceptances, behavior, and encouragements. They don't want to be held hostage to these rankings, but they do still want to be ranked highly enough that they're going to attract the best applicants. So schools have a lot to lose, but a lot to gain here. And so what I think is probably going to happen as we talk through these implications, on the whole, not much is going to change. But let's break it down piecemeal and talk about exactly what's not going to change in all likelihood as we go. The first thing, and this is the question I keep getting asked over and over, is, are there even going to be rankings anymore? Will rankings continue?
Yes.
I was going to say, that's a pretty easy question.
Next question.
The answer is yes. U.S. News is going to continue to publish these every year, same as they always have. It will include the schools that have opted out. So you will see Yale in the rankings next year, and Stanford and Georgetown and the rest of them. Whether they opt out or not, they're going to be included. However, there is certain data that is not publicly available. If the schools don't provide it, it's essentially only obtainable by the schools.
Yeah, things like expenditures per student. So let's talk about this and understand the way it works. A large majority of the data that U.S. News needs is actually publicly reported by the schools. And Yale made a point of saying, we're going to continue to publish data and possibly even additional data about who they are admitting. That can still be ranked. What's happening is that some of the measures are being self-reported by the schools, and that's what these schools are saying they won't participate in. They cannot actually pull out of the rankings in an official sense because US News doesn't need their approval to rank them. They like that data. That's what they want. And these schools are saying, look, we're not going to provide that anymore. So if you and I were sitting over at US News, what's our response? It's exactly the response that US News made last week. We're still going to rank them.
Yeah.
There's plenty of information to do so. This does not change anything. Them pulling out is just, to some extent, the accusation was performative. To do it in the public and act as if, hey, we don't care, we're not tied to this anymore. But if we're working at US News, we're still going to rank you.
Yeah.
What will happen, though, is the methodology that US News probably will change. They'll
Right.
probably drop some of these self-reported pieces. And quite honestly, I'm not against that. And the reason is this. There's been a number of scandals over the years where people actually, at various schools, misreported data.
Mm-hmm.
I think Columbia last year, the undergraduate, they figured out that they'd been misreporting data for a while. They're by no means the only school over time to have done this at either the undergraduate or graduate level. There's been a number of instances. So maybe taking away that incentive to fudge the numbers when no one else can really check on you
Right.
would be a really good thing. John, if you and I wanted to create our own, John and Dave, LSAT, kind of like law school ranking, we could do it.
Sure.
The Power School law school rankings would be easy enough for us to create. There are other rankings out there already that exist. So there's going to be a change in the methodology is what I would think, but it doesn't mean that the rankings themselves will go away. That is not going to happen.
You mentioned expenditures per student, which is one of the self-reported things that's private. It's not something they could get. That accounts for 10% of the rankings right now. So when that goes away, when schools refuse to provide that number, they're going to have to change the methodology, or they're going to have to somehow, anecdotally almost, come up with those numbers for themselves. I don't see US News doing that. I think it's also interesting, too, that the self-reporting really, it goes unpoliced. It's like if Lance Armstrong was just allowed to drug test himself. That's kind of
Wasn't he, though?
I think for a while that's how it worked. So, yeah, the honor system is risky.
Yeah, well, notice how something like expenditure per student really benefits wealthy schools, which tend to be private with huge endowments.
Mhm.
Harvard's endowment at the undergraduate level is insane.
That's billions.
Can't remember how much it is, like $30 billion. It's a massive amount they can never really spend, but that gives them the opportunity to do whatever they want. So US News does have the choice to impute a value for each school. They can assign a value. They've done this before in certain instances and say, this is what we think we're going to do. Something the IRS does when you don't file a notice. They'll say, like, this is what we think you owe us.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. US News could kind of do that right here. So you could see some changes if in the methodology. I'd expect that. That could then lead to certain changes in the ranking. However, I will point something out because a lot of people have been saying, oh, there's going to be a lot of changes in the rankings. I'm not so sure. If I'm US News and I say that these schools pulled out and won't give us data and all of a sudden they all drop, it looks like you are penalizing them.
It's vindictive at that point.
Vindictive, excellent word. It looks vindictive. Also, doesn't it kind of say that your ranking sucked in the first place? Oh, that really wasn't the number one school? I feel like what I'm going to see next year is a little bit of movement, but not that much. I feel like Yale's still going to be at the top, or maybe Harvard moves back to number 2. There's, I don't know. I don't feel like we're going to all of a sudden see some school like Washington University in St. Louis move from the fringes of the top 15 to be like number 7 or 8. It's not going to happen because I think that is a direct admission that, look, our rankings are really complete BS and they really didn't reflect reality. It's just what we wanted you to think. So they can't actually, I think they're stuck. They're calcified by history here.
Yeah, if Yale drops to 9 or something, it's like ranking suicide. You just give up the game at that point, US News.
I would, I've said it for a long time. I think the rankings are complete and utter, just a made up fantasy in a lot of instances. I get the broad tiers of schools, but to think that this school is 17 and that one is 18 is just stupid. It's kind of like football rankings. You don't know until the schools play each other. Yeah. Oh, wait a second. We're totally wrong. Tennessee isn't really that great. Speaking of sports, John, World Cup today.
Yes.
U.S. great start. Ended up with a draw, which I think feels like a disappointment.
It felt like a loss given the first half. Yeah.
Goes back to that famous, I think it was a New York Post headline years ago when the U.S. had drawn with England in the first game. It said U.S. wins 1-1.
I was sitting in a barber's chair for the first half, and let me tell you, lesson learned. Do not go into a place where every TV is turned to the World Cup. Your barber's wearing a U.S. men's national team jersey and cutting your hair with a goal on the line at any moment. That's a
Terrible.
dangerous pair of scissors to be underneath.
Gotta like it.
Kept waiting for something exciting to happen and hear the buzzer hit scalp.
Yeah, so, just going back to rankings, sorry for the small sports aside there.
It's fine.
I don't think they're actually going to change all that much. I think there'll be some movement, but I don't think they actually can, for their own integrity and, appearance of validity, make huge changes here. Maybe I'm wrong,
which
but I don't think
leads
so.
to another question I've been getting. I mean, we sit here and we kind of laugh about how seriously people take these things, as we clearly don't. But I've been asked a lot about, well, does this mean the rankings are going to somehow become ignored or marginalized, at least downplayed? Will the significance of the rankings basically decrease in the eyes of people? And I think they could a little bit, especially if U.S. News commits the rather mortal sin we just described of having a lot of them move around a bunch. I think that would shine. I think that would shine a real light on the somewhat notional concept here. But assuming things stay more or less the same, I think people are going to treat the rankings more or less the same.
Yeah, my view of this is that Americans in particular love rankings.
Mm-hmm.
We love numbered lists. We like to say they're first, they're second, we're number one. I think that a lot of people outside of applicants this year won't realize what's happening in future years. The whole law school admissions market turns itself over every single year. And there's some overlap. People are in two different markets, and sometimes people drop out and try again. So there's some, kind of persistence, but it's not a huge number. And it's one of the things that you and I always face is having, especially in the late spring and summertime, dealing with a whole new group of students. They don't know who we are. They don't know anything about LSAT preparation. And we have to kind of slowly build in the fact that, hey, we do know what we're talking about. And probably know more about what we're talking about than anybody else.
Yeah.
But it takes time.
I kind of feel like an army kid at times where every school year I'm in a new town.
Yeah. I've often lamented the fact that, in a restaurant, once you've had a great meal, you can go back and keep on trying meals there and enjoying yourself. LSAT prep is one and done. People should go through it, take a course, and hopefully they do well enough that they're out, which means that the next year you're not getting repeat business like you get at a bank or a restaurant or a retail store. So when we look at the rankings, I think that also contributes to the fact that people will likely next year not know a whole lot about this and be like, oh, rankings, here they are. The rankings, one of the things that certainly we heard in the ABA meeting is that people like to have a general guide as to what is the value proposition that they're engaged in. Oh, this is a well-regarded school. Maybe I'm spending my money more wisely. So I think that will always persist, and I think people in this country just love to rank stuff. I know I do.
And listen, part of the rankings, too, at least include objective facts about the various schools, whether it's, say, diversity of the student body, student-faculty ratios, bar passage rates, the percentage of people who go into things like service or clerkships or big law. And these are valuable things to be able to see about individual schools, regardless of how much weight you put on them as a composite school to school. So for one thing, I appreciate the rankings just because they compile stuff that's, again, objectively valuable.
Yeah, if I were to compile rankings, personally, I would do it based upon employment outcomes and salaries. That would be the outputs. That would be my huge focus. Above the Law occasionally puts out rankings that are focused on that, and I think that I found them to be relatively useful. And Yale's not number one. And there's different ways to do this. What I might consider to be valuable in comparing schools is not what you might consider. Spivey has a tool called MyRank where you can go in and just put in whatever you think is important and rank things that way. I think that's a great kind of thing. That gives you the control versus U.S. News telling you that debt per student or number of books in the library should be important.
Yeah, nobody ranks things like climate or bars per capita. These are the things that would factor in for me. So everyone's going to have a slightly different like weighting or priority system for this. But at least with the rankings as compiled by, say, US News, you can look at individual schools and see where it sits on your list of priorities. I think that's useful.
Yeah, so one of the questions that's come up out of this is what happens at the schools themselves,
Yeah.
especially the ones that have pulled out of this? Will their behavior change in terms of admissions process? Are they going to feel a greater sense of autonomy or freedom when they're making the decisions on who to admit or how they're going to give out aid or even what future career paths to encourage their students, future graduates to pursue?
Yeah, so will school behavior change? And we've talked a little bit about this as actually a motivating factor for the schools pulling out. I think schools would like for their behavior to change. How much that actually becomes the case, to me, that's a little bit of we're going to have to wait and see. So the short answer is yes. I think some schools are going to begin to operate a little differently, maybe reprioritize some things themselves. However, I don't think we're going to see huge shifts in school policy, certainly not in the short term.
And this is where the SCOTUS decision comes in, because if the SCOTUS decision forces them to have a change in policy because of that, it may be that being in this position of not having to worry about some additional things is exactly how they wanted it to be. It's just preparing for what appears to be the inevitable with the current makeup of the court.
Yeah, the question I've been asked a lot related to this, and I think we'll probably explore it a little more in terms of criteria, but a lot of students have been asking me, like, is this going to change my admissions odds? Does this actually affect my likelihood of getting into higher ranked or lower ranked schools?
I've gotten that so many times already.
And again, what I've kind of had to do is just kick the can a bit. Like, we're going to have to wait and see on a couple of things.
I'm getting, especially test optional plays in this, which we're about to get to, but I've gotten a lot of chance me requests. I don't like doing chance me requests. Remember, the numbers change every year.
Yeah.
So, and the needs of the school change literally week by week as their class grows. So chance me is, what do you think would have happened last year to me?
Right.
Sure, I have a pretty good sense of that. That doesn't mean it's going to happen this year. And right now, the big question has been about, well, are they going to change the criteria that they use in the admissions process right now in the middle of the year to kind of make determination? And that would not be a wise thing for any of these schools to do. Once they begin a certain pathway, to all of a sudden change how you're evaluating students in the middle is not what I would consider to be the best course of action. And remember, they still have to report all this information. All this GPA, LSAT, median stuff comes out in the 509 disclosures. Mm-hmm. That is still going to happen this year, and those will not be affected by that. So ultimately, I don't think a whole lot's going to change in the short term. We can talk a little bit more about that, though, as we get into test optional.
Which is part 2 of the breaking news that we're getting into here. So let's talk a little bit about the old ABA. And what's interesting is this is something we've touched on a little bit before, almost a prelude to this discussion and what happened last Friday as you and I sat through a somewhat tedious 2 hours of debate.
Somewhat? It was tedious.
Fair enough. I was trying to be diplomatic. I'm not sure why.
I have so many comments.
So let's talk about this idea of this ABA announcement about test optional admissions. Shorthand.
Yeah. So first off, if you're not aware of it, back in LSAT podcast episode 109, we covered this. It's called the LSAT-Optional proposal. Has the ABA lost its mind? And we kind of really went through what they were up to. This is another step in the process. And so John and I attended the online meeting that they had Friday. The ABA is the American Bar Association. They see the licensure and operation of all law schools and lawyers. And as you become a lawyer, you get very used to seeing the ABA floating around. And they have various sections. And one of the sections, which is the section on legal education, oversees the operation of law schools. And they have a series of standards. One of the standards has been Standard 503, which for years specified that all law schools, 501 said you had to have sound admissions practices, and Standard 503 said you have to use a standardized test, namely the LSAT, as part of your process. So the ABA for a long time said you must use the LSAT. Then the GRE showed up and started agitating around the edges, and they got the language changed to you must use a standardized test. And now there's been a proposal that's come in that says, well, maybe we should change that to the schools can use a standardized test at their discretion, essentially creating a test optional environment where a school could continue to use the LSAT, or they might be able to just say, no, we're not going to actually use that. And we talked about these implications back in episode 109. What you saw on Friday was the council, which is essentially the leadership section of legal education, sitting down and voting on whether or not to approve that language and send it to the House of Delegates, which is the overall ABA, the big meeting that they have. And unsurprisingly, they did, in fact, after considering this for a long time, vote yes. And it was overwhelmingly in favor to make it test optional. It was 15-1. I thought it might be maybe 2 or 3 people, but it was 15-1 ultimately. And so what will happen now is that they will send that to the ABA House of Delegates in February, where they will vote on it. Obviously, one of 2 things happens. First off, they can approve it. At that point, it becomes approved, and then it'll be implemented at some point in the future, which we'll talk about in a second, because the date that it gets implemented is important. They could say no, though.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lawyers who are like, they think the LSAT's of high value. They think it helps certain groups, and it also establishes a baseline of performance that they want to see in the legal profession. They all had to take it. They're kind of tied to it. So it is possible that we get a vote there that says, no, we want to keep the LSAT, or at least the LSAT and the GRE, a standardized test, and not go test optional. That wouldn't be the end of the line. That would kick the proposal back to this Legal Education Council, and I think they would overrule them. So no matter what you have here, the outcome is very likely that what was proposed here this Friday, wherein any standardized test is an optional choice by the law school, it's probably the outcome we're going to get.
Yeah, I'll note 2 things about what you just said. The first is we could see about 16 people on camera during this thing. That was the 15-1 as we saw hands go up, yay and nay. But I got the feeling, Dave, that they were actually in a room with some people as well. I thought they took almost 2 separate votes. Regardless, it was pretty overwhelmingly yay for the test optional. The second thing is they had representatives from both ETS, the group that administers the GRE, and from LSAC, including Kelly Testy, the CEO of LSAC, in the room, or at least on camera, delivering not only what I thought were fairly impassioned pleas to keep it as test mandatory, but they made a lot of really compelling, cogent points about why these tests do perform such a valuable role in the overall admissions process. And they swayed virtually no one. So when we talk about the likelihood of this thing ultimately ended up passing, I'm not sure what more arguments could be brought to bear against it that would win the day.
Yeah, I actually thought it was set up in the wrong way for the defenders of using a test. They had Dave Klieger from ETS, who represents the GRE, go in there, and they really grilled him hard on a lot of things. And I'm not sure I would have wanted to have been in his seat to kind of deal with those questions. I thought it was a real challenge. He's got a lot of experience, certainly in the numbers in the GRE, but a lot of the questions were really built around the idea of, so you think we have to have this? You don't think we can be trusted to make our own decisions? There were certain discussions about like how much work it would be to take in students who might require a little bit more assistance. There was all sorts of different discussions about like whether or not this actually does help diversity and whether or not it gives students an opportunity. I thought he struggled, to be honest with you. And I've heard him talk before. I know how intelligent he is, but I don't think that was the best environment. I think it would have been better to have LSAC go first. They immediately, I think, established a little bit more of an even keel, but I felt that after ETS had gone that the whole thing was dead.
Yeah.
It was like there's no hope. And then I thought LSAC actually did a pretty credible job, although I think they struggled at certain points. And they had Kelly Testy there and another one of their representatives who I thought were both, made excellent points, but you could tell the room was against them. But one of the things that LSAC said that I found to be fascinating as a straight up, claim was that Kelly Testy said that GPAs are so inflated today as to be worthless.
Yeah, meaningless, I think might have been the word she used.
It was worthless.
Was it worthless?
It was worthless. I wrote it down. It's a direct quote. And I was like, look, we know grade inflation's an issue, but to say they're worthless and that therefore the LSAT's really the only kind of like quantitative metric among students that is viable, that was a tough claim. And there was also a lot of discussion about like how much work it is to get students up to certain academic levels. And I thought that that was a losing argument because you're talking to schools. They feel like they can do this. If you're going to say that this is a problem of resources, no one's going to buy it. You have to have a better argument. But I thought they did make some better arguments about the way it's helped over time. But they went at it for a while, and then they got down to the end, and then they voted, and it was 15-1. So I was like, well, for a moment, I was like, maybe they'll be able to get what they want.
I thought maybe.
Because ETS and LSAZ have been in a battle for years, and now they have to, be on the same team. So instead of like shooting bullets at each other, at this point, they're now rowing in the same direction. So they're having to help each other out. They were very complimentary to each group, but we knew it was a losing battle. I think they did too. However, John. There was an amendment to the language that was thrown in at the very last minute, and I was thinking it was almost like a Qatari World Cup. Who got paid off? I wanted to know like who got the check, and I'm just joking. I'm not actually making a real.
Then let me say it. I won't be joking.
Nah, but somebody, and I couldn't see the name, said, "Hey, I'm all for this. I want to work through this," but they wanted to talk about the way that schools might be able to implement different ways of handling incoming students, especially those who might be more academic challenged, without a standardized test present. And so the proposal was made not to implement this idea until fall of 2025. Now, that presumably means that that's when the requirement would be lifted. And so applicants in the 2025 to 2026 cycle would be then the very first to experience a test optional policy scenario. That's years from now. That gives. And again, someone would say, oh boy, why so long? This is the law. Things move glacially. They look at themselves as like a 100-year organization. They don't think about 1 or 2 years as being a big deal. They want to get it right. And so what they're really saying is we want to give schools the opportunity to consider this, to put programs into place, and to figure out how they would actually help these students and to admit the best possible candidates. That means if you're applying this year or next year or the year after and you're thinking test optional, forget it. It's not going to happen. It is LSAT or GRE for the time being.
Yeah, this came up actually by I don't know what you call them, the council members at minutes before they were going to take a vote on it. Someone said, I propose we do this. It was at the very end, the 11th hour, really, where they kind of threw this bone. And no debate. Yeah, nobody seemed to push back and be like, no, we need this immediately. And I thought this was a really sensible thing to do. It was very clear from the nature of the conversations there that several things remained, if not undecided, at least too ambiguous to implement now.
Now, this is one of the points that I've seen miscovered by the national media. The first one, goes back to these schools pulling out of the U.S. News and World Report. Everybody's like, they're not going to be in it anymore. I'm like, that's not what this is saying.
Right.
The second one was here with test optional. I saw a number of headlines that were like, you don't need the LSAT anymore. I'm like, okay, it hasn't even been approved finally. It still has at least one more step, possibly 2 more steps before it gets approved. And then you're still going to need it because it wouldn't come in play until 2025. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, that's when, I'm going to apply. Congratulations, because you've got an early start on things. I'm impressed.
What are you doing here? You're a sophomore.
You've got your act together way more than I did when I was a sophomore or freshman in college. So kudos to you. But you're seeing a lot of reporting about, law schools don't have to worry about the LSAT. They don't have to worry about U.S. News. I'm like, nothing is going to change. So that is one of the big takeaways there. And I actually posted that on Twitter over the weekend. I was like, you're seeing 2 things, but both of these are still valid. Nothing is going to change in the short term here. So let's talk about what happens then very briefly, John.
Okay.
Because let's just fast forward to 2025. And all of a sudden, the ABA has passed all of this, and they are saying you can go ahead, and it's your call as to whether or not to use a test. We're not going to mandate it anymore. What are some of the implications that we see at that point?
Well, I think schools at that point, let's say again it does pass, schools are going to fall, in my mind, into three groups. There's the obvious group that opts immediately for the no test. Maybe they use other metrics like GPA, student background, resume, essays. So that's one group. It's just like, look, there's no multiple choice as part of getting in here, but we're going to look at your other things. Maybe they do interviews. Who knows? There's a middle ground here where schools could require a test of their own design or their own making. We've seen some schools flirt with this. We've even been, at least I know I have, contacted by schools, school representatives to talk about designing tests for them.
Yep.
Which I've always found to be an interesting
Why
avenue.
would you do that?
Yeah. But the vast, vast majority certainly are going to continue to rely on the LSAT and the GRE. They may not have to, but they will choose to because they work and they know how to use them.
Yeah. And the first thing that I would say is go back to episode 109 and listen to our discussion of this. We went into detail, but I'll summarize what we largely said. Is that at the top and the bottom, you probably won't see much of a change. Schools at the top have been well served by the LSAT. It's proven itself to be a distinguisher. That information is still going to be reported to the ABA. It will still be used by U.S. News to rank them. So even though they're like, we're not participating in the rankings, they're still going to get ranked. Your LSAT score is still going to matter if you're going to Northwestern or Harvard or what happens. That is unavoidable. They're not going to simply like opt themselves out of the ranking by saying, nope, they can't, they must report it to the ABA. They cannot get out of that requirement because the ABA is the overlord here.
Yeah.
On the flip side, at the lower end of what are the current rankings or the schools that are, not considered as challenging academically, they need the LSAT. The LSAT is correlated to first-year performance in law school as well as bar passage rates. They rely upon certain LSAT minimums in their mind to be like, we're admitting students that we think can graduate and pass the bar. Nobody, most especially the student, wants to go through law school, spend 3 years there of time and money, and then not be able to pass the bar. That is the worst possible outcome. The LSAT has traditionally been looked at as a test that assists schools in making the decision between students, especially at the lower end, who may or may not be able to do the work and to pass the bar. They're not going to change that. They need to make sure that they can graduate students who are viable because Standard 501 of the ABA says that's what they have to do. And if you can't do it, you put yourself into a situation where you're literally under administration. And eventually, if you continue to fail in that mission, you go out of business as a law school.
Yeah.
And it's happened before. It's not a new thing.
Yeah, Kelly raised this point, and I thought it was a very good one that she made of the LSAT's not prohibitive if you want to let in diverse students, people who maybe would need a little more help finding their footing or getting off to a good start in law school. In fact, the LSAT can be a really useful identification tool of those students. How do you know? You wait till they're a semester or two in a hole, and then you try to help them dig out? No, you can see this coming with a test like the LSAT and get them some sort of proactive assistance. And Dave, you'll find this funny too, and I swear to you, I'm not making this up. While you were talking, my phone just buzzed, and I looked over, and it was my mom, and she has just texted me, "Your thoughts on law schools making LSAT optional? 4 question marks." I swear that happened 4 minutes ago. Normally I don't have my phone anywhere near me when we do these things, but she's either bugged my place or it's just too coincidental. Clearly the news is out.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, some news organizations run a thing about how law schools are destroying standards. And so it filtered its way to her, and now she's checking on you.
Yep. Filtered its way down to her somehow. I'm sure it must have been on Fox News. That's the only possible way.
Your mom is an advocate. Or at least a watcher.
That's right.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
You and I don't spend a whole lot of time.
Absolutely not. But it does, I think, speak to the value of us trying to stay ahead of this stuff, especially when it comes to like curbing misinformation, because this is frankly riddled with misinformation, misinterpretation, and whether it's intentional or not, a lot of fear has come about from this and uncertainty.
Yeah. And by the way, Kelly's point is great. If they could use the LSAT as kind of a diagnostic tool, this then triggered the conversation of what kind of resources would you need to help those students. And Kelly initially had kind of made the idea of like, well, it's so much work and, you don't want to overtax the schools. And I could see visible bristling among the council saying, really, that's what you're thinking about? maybe we go a different direction with it. So they pushed back on that idea that it would be too much work, but it is true. If you love the way someone is looking as an applicant and then their LSAT score is showing you that they would be borderline to get through law school and the bar, if you choose to admit them, that helps you to be able to say, we need to give that person extra resources.
Yeah.
So the big takeaway then, John, is knowing that this happened with the test optional stuff, the question that I know you and I got inundated with is, what does that change for me this year or next year?
I love this question because any question with an easy answer is fantastic. Nothing. It changes absolutely nothing.
This won't affect you.
Yeah.
It won't be test optional until at least the start of 25-26 admission season. Unless you're in that group, you're the person who would have to think about this. I can also tell you historically, based upon what deans have said to me, they think that people who take the LSAT are showing that they're serious about going to law school. Yeah. They've used this test for 70 years. They trust it to some extent to be indicative. If you think, well, I don't have to take it, and you've got a lower GPA, the school's not all of a sudden going to take a chance on you. That's not going to change. And I realize for some people, that's kind of like, bummer. And I get that because I share some of that. I think that the LSAT is overvalued in this process. And as I've already said, I think rankings suck. So I'm not like an admirer of the status quo. I think there are better ways and other ways to do this. I've long thought about creating a challenger to the LSAT, but I'm so tired at this point.
Yeah, you're going to need a caffeinated beer, I think.
I would need a caffeinated like 3 years to get through that process.
But serious is the word we've heard people use about candidates who take this test, applicants who take this test. We've even seen them use it relating the LSAT to the GRE and some of the pushback. You're taking the GRE because you're not as serious or you can't succeed on the LSAT. So when the LSAT's held in that high of an esteem, suddenly the idea of taking the LSAT versus taking nothing, I think you're running a big risk regardless of what the school's policies might be.
Yeah, they may say test optional, but remember what I said before about the law, glacial movement at the law school level. Maybe in 10, 15 years we come back, John, and we're like, oh, look at that. It's not considered a high-value test any longer, or things have really changed. I don't see that in the next several years at all. And I don't even see it in the first year or two after test optional is essentially adopted as we expect that it will be. So for now, it means the status quo is in play. If you want me to chance you, there's no reason to ask because it'll be exactly the same answer as it was, 6 months ago, which is usually, I hate doing that. So I'm not asking for chance me messages. Don't ask me.
Yeah, please don't.
John, I think that's it.
So there you go. I will wrap up with one thought that has kind of itched at me this whole way through, which is with all of these developments, with the breaking news nature of this, it does seem like in both instances, the rankings and the optional LSAT, we essentially concluded that nothing changes. They don't really matter for anyone listening to this right now. So what is this little voice in the back of my head the whole time has been like, I wonder if this meeting could have been an email. Hopefully people found the interpretation of these things useful. But if you were expecting some grand outcome or proactive change to your prep plans, I'm sorry to say nothing has changed.
Well, I will say that sometimes knowing a greater degree of firmness around your plans really does help.
Yeah.
There were a number of people who were like, wait, am I going to get a Hail Mary here and get out of the LSAT or not have to worry about this as much in my law school applications? And I know that's an attractive idea. It is to everybody. It's just not the way it's going to turn out for a variety of reasons. This can only affect somebody several years down the road. It is not affecting any of us right now. So there's a lot of news around it. I see a lot of misreporting, and I pointed out some of that. It's more of a tempest in a teapot. And to some extent, it certainly seems like the law schools are setting themselves up to deal with a new reality after the SCOTUS decision with Harvard this summer. And as far as the ABA, they seem to want to be of the mindset that we're going to allow greater latitude and variation in how you admit students going forward. We're going to give you the opportunity to work that out, but it's not going to happen immediately. Things move slowly in this field.
Yeah. So prioritize the LSAT, get the highest score you can, and go to the best school you can, whether that's built on rankings, which will continue to exist. I did actually get this message on Reddit the other day from somebody who said, I've applied to only top 14s. Is that even going to be a thing?
Yes.
Yes, of course it is. If you got into one of the schools that pulled out of the rankings, that school hasn't just disappeared. They're still the school that they were when you applied. They will be
And
next year.
you'll still get better financial aid packages based upon how good your LSAT score is.
All the metrics that assigned that ranking to them are still true.
Yep. Right now, everything stays the same. We'll see how it unfolds. And obviously, one of our jobs is to keep track of that and keep everybody informed. But if you are preparing, hopefully this gives you at least a clear sense of where things are and where things are going. And that was the whole point of this. On that note, John, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may see it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment or a rating. We'll be off the air for the next week and a half or so. But when we come back, we'll probably do a mailbag. So if you have any questions about this or admissions or the LSAT or preparing for the test, please send those questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you have a great Thanksgiving holiday that is coming up here. We intend to, and we will talk to you soon. Stay safe out there.